A priest is said to be a symbol of peace, forgiveness, and hope. An icon of goodness in a world that too often forgets what it means to be human. But for some people, the face of a priest does not inspire peace, but anger. And in the case we will discuss today, that face became the target of unimaginable violence. It was the evening of March 21, 1975, in a small village called Shorne, in Kent, England. Police, called to strange movements in a small house, were confronted with a scene so shocking that it would make even the most experienced investigators' blood run cold. Priest Anthony Crean, 64, was found in his bathtub, still fully clothed. The water had a strange dark hue, and the walls and ceiling were covered in spatter that indicated a violent physical attack. His head had been badly bruised. Everything suggested that a sharp object had been used. His face was visibly damaged, and marks from the blows were scattered all over his body. It was obvious that this was not a sudden outburst, but an act charged with deep emotion, as if the attacker had wanted to express all his fury before ending everything. Anthony Crean was known as a kind and calm man. For years he had served as a chaplain in a Carmelite monastery, believing in forgiveness and second chances. It was precisely because of that belief that 2 years earlier he had decided to help a young man, lost, troubled, but still, in his opinion, worthy of a spiritual guide. The boy had broken into his home and stolen some things. Yet Crean did not turn his back on him, just as the priest in the novel Les Miserables offered him a new chance. He believed that kindness could reach even the darkest minds. It was a fatal mistake because that same young man, once he had lost control again, returned to the very man who had believed in him the most. And so began a night that would remain recorded in British criminal records as one of the most terrifying. Thanks to the priest's previous connection to the young man, it didn't take long for the police to identify the suspect. After just 48 hours, Patrick David Mackay was arrested. During questioning, he showed no sign of remorse. Without emotion, without tears, he recounted in detail what had happened, how it had happened, what he had done. And the most disturbing thing was that he spoke as if he were satisfied with the outcome. But Father Crean's case was only the latest in a long series. It was just the beginning of the uncovering of a much larger picture, marked by violence, manipulation, and loss. Patrick Mackay, then 23 years old, already had a dark past behind him, a past that the authorities had repeatedly ignored. Psychiatric reports, school reports, even court records, everything was there, but no one had pulled the brakes in time. Born on September 25, 1952 in England, Patrick had grown up in a dysfunctional family. His father, Harold Mackay, known as Harry, was an accountant and World War II veteran, but behind closed doors he was a man with serious problems. He struggled with alcoholism, was frustrated with his life, and took it out on his family members. His mother was constantly verbally and physically abused, and Patrick was often the target of abuse. The girls, Patrick says, were not touched, but he was, often brutally. From an early age he learned to be quiet and withdrawn. When he was 10, his father died of a chronic illness linked to alcohol abuse. His last words to his son were, "Yes, good," words that should have had great meaning, but which remained as a painful reminder of the years in which that child had been abandoned to his own devices. After his father's death, he was not even allowed to see the body or attend the funeral. He was completely excluded. He began to tell others that his father was still alive. He carried his photographs with him and said that he had simply not seen him for a while, as if he wanted to erase the painful reality and replace it with his own invented version. Even then, deep fractures began to form in his psyche, fractures that would become something much more dangerous over time. The violent nights and daily fear left a deep mark on the child's soul. Patrick Mackay, then barely 10 years old, probably thought that he himself was the cause of everything that happened to him. A child of that age does not know how to distinguish real guilt. When adults shout, threaten and destroy everything around them, the child often believes that he is the source of that chaos. That burden does not lift. He shared it with no one. Patrick, on the other hand, withdrew into himself. He was neglected, often dirty, and hungry for attention and care. At school he stood out as someone who made up stories, broke rules, and caused trouble. He had no friends. On the contrary, he often provoked or mistreated the weakest, behaving like those he had seen at home, as if he had absorbed the pattern that had previously frightened him. Subsequent psychological reports indicate a well-known behavioral pattern. The model, called the violent formation process, consists of 4 stages: exposure to domination and aggression, development of resistance, learning violent behavior, and finally applying what he has learned. First, the child is a victim, then he decides that he will never be weak again. Someone shows him how to use force, and finally he begins to do so. Patrick Mackay, experts say, went through all these stages. Soon he began to show serious signs of behavioral disorder. He did not limit himself to insulting other children. He began to direct his aggression against animals as well. It is said that he repeatedly tried to hurt the family tortoise. A woman he later described him as a child who watched cars run over injured birds. He spoke about death without emotion, coldly. He began stealing things from the homes of elderly people, and from an early age he used alcohol, using it to fuel his anger. Once he started a fire in a church. This was not just a good thing, it seemed like an act of deep rage. From an early age he showed an obsession with death. He grew up listening to his father's stories of war, loss, destruction, and his mind filled with violent images began to develop fantasies. An acquaintance recounted that Patrick once asked, "Are Dad's bones rotting in the earth?" Even though he was just a child, there was something deeply disturbing about that question. His mother Marion could no longer handle him. She agreed to have him placed in a facility for children with behavioral problems, but despite the warnings of experts, she later took him back home. The whole family even moved to Guyana, hoping that a new beginning would bring peace. It did not. They returned to London and moved in with relatives. Tensions and arguments became a daily occurrence. After a further attempt to find stability, Marion moved to Gravesend. Patrick found 2 short-term jobs, but quickly lost them. He ended up living on welfare. He continued to display problematic behavior. He was aggressive, threatening, stealing, and abusive. A social worker wrote that there was a real risk that Patrick would commit a serious act if he remained in that environment. Yet the system failed to intervene in time. Shortly afterwards, Patrick attempted to physically assault his mother. He then had an episode in which he tried to harm himself. He claimed to still be living with his father and to see things that were not there. He was referred for further assessment and again released. Sometime later, he attacked a younger child. He later stated that the outcome would have been fatal if he had not been stopped. Only then was he finally admitted to a facility with enhanced supervision. This was the first of several stays in psychiatric institutions. At just 15 years old, one of the UK's most renowned forensic psychiatrists, Dr. Leonard Carr, described him as a person with a severe emotional disturbance, prone to cold and calculated behavior. The warning was serious and clear. At the time, there were only a few specialist facilities in England with adequate security measures for cases like his. In October 1968, Patrick Mackay was sent to the Moss Side facility in Liverpool. There he underwent a series of psychological tests and assessments in preparation for prolonged therapy. But what the specialists discovered was only the beginning of a much darker story. The doctors analyzed in detail the behaviors Patrick had displayed since early childhood: aggression towards the weak, hostility towards animals, a tendency to steal, truancy, social isolation, and an almost obsessive urge to start fires. By the age of 11, he was already known to the local police. He had stolen items from a neighbor's house and tried to blame it on someone else. Around the same time, his mother, Marion, suffered a severe emotional breakdown and spent 4 months hospitalized. Patrick was left to fend for himself, unsupervised, in an increasingly unstable environment. His father was dead, his mother absent, and his world chaotic and filled with rejection. The social worker who was following his case in the juvenile system wrote that she didn't know where to start. The situation was completely out of control. Like many at the time, she believed that Patrick would simply outgrow his outbursts, but experts who knew behavioral disorders knew otherwise. Patrick's aggression was not a passing phase. It was a way of surviving in a world that had hurt him from the start. The environment in which he had grown up had only intensified those impulses. Professionals had repeatedly warned that there was a real risk that he would develop dangerous behaviors, but as so many times before, those warnings went unheeded. The team of psychiatrists following his case conducted a battery of tests, including brainwave analysis. The results were within the normal range for behavioral disorders at the time. However, one of the specialists suggested that he had inherited a genetic predisposition from his father, which could indicate a personality disorder. The emotional distance between him and his mother further exacerbated the situation. Some of his most violent outbursts of rage occurred in his mother's presence. At the time, the term intermittent explosive disorder was not yet an official diagnosis, but today's experts believe that Patrick Mackay would fit perfectly into that category. Sudden outbursts of rage, destruction of objects, and aggression for no apparent reason were his daily behavior. During his stay in various facilities between the ages of 11 and 14, several doctors recommended prolonged hospitalization in a controlled environment. According to them, he was deeply disturbed, sometimes displaying childish and regressive behavior. He slept with a toy, forcing others to treat him like a real person. Emotionally, he was far below his chronological age. One psychiatrist said that childhood trauma had left irreversible damage. Another was even more blunt. He predicted that Patrick would one day become a threat to women. At the time, there was a common tendency in psychology to blame mothers, especially if they were emotionally absent or unpredictable. Today we know that this approach was simplistic and unfair. Psychiatrists agreed that Patrick suffered from a severe personality disorder, but without elements of psychosis. In other words, he was aware of his actions, but did not feel the way most people would feel in similar situations. The court that assessed his condition found nothing worrisome, further confirming how cleverly these disorders can be hidden. He had 2 lengthy hospital stays and was released each time. Despite experts' warning of his potential danger, their assessments were not given the weight they deserved in the system of the time. The public believed that no one was lost forever, but Patrick Mackay was getting closer and closer to the edge, and with each release that edge became thinner. It was during this time that he began to develop another dark obsession, Nazi ideology. Nazism, an extreme form of totalitarian regime that ruled Germany from 1933 to 1945, promoted ideas of domination, racial purity, and militarism. Patrick identified with those values. He was fascinated by strength, discipline, and the concept of control. Values extolled by that ideology. He admired Adolf Hitler and believed in the superiority of certain peoples. His interest was not academic in nature. It was deeply personal and charged with emotional meaning, just as that ideology identified enemies in others. So Patrick began to seek out targets in his environment, people he considered weak, undesirable, or simply others he wished to eliminate from his life. That ideology became his personal poison, and soon that poison would emerge from his mind and transform into a series of terrifying events that would shake the whole of England. Although Nazi ideology was outlawed by law in Germany after its defeat in World War II, groups that sought to revive those extreme and dangerous ideas, known today as neo-Nazis, continued to exist in some areas of Europe. The belief in the superiority of certain peoples survived in those circles, along with the idea that aggression was justified towards those who considered themselves superior. Patrick Mackay did not simply accept that philosophy. In it he found his identity. He gave himself a new name, Franklin Boulevard. He created an improvised uniform, donned symbols linked to Nazi iconography, and put on boots similar to those of extremist military formations. Dressed in this way with an armband, he walked the streets of London. He believed himself to be powerful, destined to change the world. His room resembled a small ideological museum of that era, full of books, photographs, and symbols. He kept a picture of Heinrich Himmler by his bed. This was not simply a historical interest, it was an obsession with brutality, racial purity, and absolute control. He even worried that he himself did not live up to this ideal, since his family background was not pure by his own standards. His behavior became increasingly disturbing. He tried living with his mother, but conflicts quickly erupted. They argued over money, food, and daily chores. He moved in with his aunts, but he could not stay there either. He was unstable, confrontational, and unpredictable. People avoided contact with him. One of the most disturbing habits he developed was assembling models inspired by the figure of Frankenstein's monster. He did not simply assemble them, he would pierce them with pins, burn parts of them, and talk to them as if they were living beings. This ritual unsettled even those closest to him. In the meantime, he began using various psychoactive substances. He spent much of his time in an altered state of consciousness. He couldn't hold down a job. Social security was his only source of income. Sometimes he would break into people's apartments, not to steal valuables, but to look for cigarettes, food, or coins. His social worker couldn't handle the situation anymore. Patrick didn't show up for his scheduled meetings, contact became increasingly rare, and his behavior became increasingly unstable. He had no goals or ambitions, just anger and a need to hurt someone. And then, almost by fate, Patrick found himself in front of a person who still had enough compassion to reach out to him. It happened in a forest near his mother's house. Wandering aimlessly, he came to a Carmelite convent where elderly nuns lived and cared for the elderly. In a small house next to the convent lived Father Anthony Crean with his dog. Father Crean was completely different from anyone Patrick had ever known. He didn't mock him, he didn't denounce him, he didn't scold him. On the contrary, he talked to him about faith, forgiveness, change. He wanted to help him. But Patrick didn't see that kindness as a possibility, he saw weakness. Father Crean offered him a meal, a kind word, a place where he could feel welcome. Patrick, on the surface, accepted all this. He began to show up more often, helping in the garden, chopping wood, talking to the priest, but deep down something had already started to stir. Nothing Father Crean offered him could calm what had been growing in Patrick's psyche for years. A deep anger against the world, a hatred fueled by violent ideologies, a sense of superiority and the desire to dominate. The priest, perhaps unknowingly, became the perfect target, a symbol of everything Patrick despised: gentleness, forgiveness, faith and humanity. What happened a few months later in that same little house next to the convent will go down in the crime chronicles as one of the most shocking attacks on a clergyman in modern British history. Father Crean was one of the few who had genuinely tried to reach out to a man who almost no one dared approach. He was known for his approach to the lost, the abandoned, those in desperate need of understanding and support. Patrick Mackay seemed to fit that profile perfectly, but what Father Crean didn't know and probably could never have imagined was that it is impossible to form a genuine emotional relationship with someone suffering from a severe personality disorder. These individuals lack empathy, a sense of connection, or an understanding of other people's emotions. Whatever may seem like friendship on the outside is often just a manipulative strategy in their minds. Father Crean even went so far as to invite Patrick to the local pub for a drink. Their meetings there became regular. It seemed that the priest managed to calm him down, at least for a while, but it didn't last. Patrick was unable to control his impulses. Despite that connection, he forced his way into the priest's home and stole a £30 check. Father Crean reported him to the police, not to punish him, but out of a sense of responsibility. He didn't press charges, but the police did. The case went to court. Patrick said he would pay back the money, but he never did. Instead, the check was altered. The amount was increased to £80. The episode marked a deep rift between the two. Disillusioned and furious, Mackay left the area and returned to London. There, things went back to business as usual: short-term jobs, constant moving, petty crimes and new arrests. He was given a fine and a suspended sentence. The system, as it had so often done in the past, didn't know how to intervene. There was no basis for a longer detention, nor were there mechanisms to adequately address his psychological state, and even then it was suspected that Patrick was involved in more serious crimes. In late 1973, speculation began that he was responsible for more attacks, including one to which he confessed. He claimed to have pushed a man into the Thames. Police linked him to other incidents, but there was no hard evidence. In February of the following year, the situation escalated. That winter, Mackay broke into a house in Chelsea, London. The house was home to an elderly woman named Isabella Griffith, 84. Some sources claim they had met before. Patrick may have helped her carry some bags. Other sources claim the robbery was a random one. In any case, Isabella either recognized him or thought she knew who he was that day. A few days later, Mackay attempted to harm himself. Police found him and took him for a psychiatric evaluation, despite his extensive history of threats, assaults, and erratic behavior. One of the doctors concluded that Patrick did not suffer from a mental illness, but rather a personality disorder. He was briefly detained and then released. On February 14th of that year, he was released from the facility. He was in particularly critical condition. That same day, he went directly to Isabella Griffith's home. When she opened the door, she said she didn't need help that day. Patrick interpreted those words as rejection, humiliation, and a personal insult, and at that moment his anger exploded. He pushed open the door and forced his way in. Within minutes, he had attacked the elderly woman and killed her. There was no rational motive. He wasn't looking for money, he didn't want shelter, he hadn't planned an escape. The simple sense of rejection was enough to trigger the tragedy. After the murder, he moved the body to the kitchen. In a deeply altered state of mind, he performed a series of strange and disturbing actions. He took a knife from the kitchen and stabbed the now lifeless body. He left the knife there, then sat down in the living room. He ate something, drank, turned on the radio, and behaved as if he were at home. Later, he returned to the body, closed the woman's eyes, covered her, turned on the water in the sink and also put a pair of shoes in it. The reason was never clarified. When he left the house, he took only a lighter and threw the knife into a bush. Isabella Griffith's body was found almost 2 weeks later. At first, the police thought it was a natural death. It was only during the autopsy that signs of violence were discovered. The case was then entrusted to the Special Unit for Serious Crimes. Public opinion was deeply shaken. The police launched an appeal for information from the public, but no one could have imagined that this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would soon shock the entire nation. Isabella Griffith's death went almost unnoticed. Her body was found only after almost 2 weeks, and it was initially thought that she had died of natural causes. It was only when the coroner noticed signs of injury and unusual details in the surroundings that the police opened an investigation. There were no witnesses or hard evidence. Patrick Mackay once again escaped responsibility and thus learned that he could do the worst without anyone asking questions. For the next few months, Patrick lived without a fixed abode. He slept wherever he could, usually with those who took him in out of pity or duty. One of these was a social worker who was ordered by the state to provide him with temporary housing. Later, anonymously, this man recounted the days he spent with Mackay. Days filled with dark fantasies, talk of inner urges to hurt others, of forces he sensed within himself. He said he felt relief when Patrick left, but he didn't get far. He came back and robbed him. He was arrested and sentenced to 4 months in prison. But prison did not change his nature. On the contrary, he used that time to come up with a new plan, a plan to, he said, get revenge on society for everything that had been done to him. He felt betrayed, ignored, and deceived. Now it was his turn. At first, it was a matter of scams and petty theft. He would approach elderly women, pretending to be friendly. When he gained their trust, he would enter their homes and take what he could. Sometimes, however, these encounters would end in tragedy. On March 10, 1975, he knocked on the door of Mrs. Adele Price, an 89-year-old woman who lived in a multi-apartment building. When she answered the door, she asked him if he wanted a glass of water, let him in, offered him a drink, and they began talking. Little did she know that she had just welcomed danger into her home. Patrick approached her from behind and attacked her. The injuries she sustained were fatal. She fell unconscious in the hallway, still wearing her coat. She made no attempt to defend herself. There was no struggle, nothing was stolen, there was no motive other than the anger that exploded inside him. He later stated that the act left him with a strange feeling that lasted for days. He did not explain what he meant, perhaps a sense of control, perhaps of superiority. Then, with coolness and lucidity, he sat down on his couch and fell asleep. He was awakened by a noise at the door. It was Mrs. Price's niece, who lived in the same building. He tried to open the door, but couldn't. He went to use the telephone in the hallway. At that moment, MCI came out of the apartment and walked past her. She didn't recognize him. There were many people living in the building and he was unfamiliar to her. As in the case of Isabella Griffith, it was initially thought that Mrs. Price had died of natural causes. Only later did the autopsy reveal signs of violence. The police launched a new investigation, but without any concrete evidence. This case too remained unsolved. 5 days later, Patrick attempted to take his own life, was hospitalized again and, as so many times before, was soon released. During this period, Mackay spoke more and more often about Father Anthony Crean. Some in his circle provoked him by suggesting that there had been something more between them. Those words affected him deeply. In his mind, they became the pretext to resolve everything once and for all. On March 21, 1975, Patrick Mackay headed to Kent, to Father Crean's house. He was carrying 2 knives. He traveled by train from London. On the way, he stopped at his mother's house and brought her some chicken, asking her to cook it. Then, without saying anything, he continued towards the monastery. The door of Father Crean's cottage was ajar. He went in and called out to him. The priest saw him and tried to get away. Patrick wouldn't let him. A fight broke out, striking with his hands. Father Crean tried to take refuge in another room, probably to lock himself in, but Key managed to reach him. The priest fell backwards into the bathtub. That's when Patrick attacked him. First with his hands, then he pulled out one of the knives. He stabbed him several times, including in the throat and head. At one point he tried to inflict a fatal blow, but failed. I grabbed him, he later said, and continued to hit him. Father Crean tried to protect himself by raising his arms, but the blows became increasingly violent. He eventually lost consciousness. In those moments, in his own words, Mackay lost control. Something exploded inside me. That's how Patrick Mackay later described Father Anthony Crean's last moments. He struck him relentlessly, in the face and head, until the wounds became fatal. The priest was still conscious, but he was getting weaker by the minute. It was then that Mackay inserted the stopper into the tub and turned on the water. He sat on the edge and watched as his former friend and spiritual guide tried to move his arms, to get out, to stay afloat. The water rose slowly as the priest's strength waned. It took almost an hour for it all to be over. At one point Patrick touched his wounded head and said he felt a strange excitement. And then it was over. Father Crean died and Mays sat in the bathroom for another 15 minutes in silence. He watched the lifeless body, without any emotion. Then he got up, left the house and went straight to his mother for the dinner she had prepared for him. That evening, a nun from the nearby convent found the body and immediately called the police. The investigation began quickly. The police were already aware of the connection between Patrick and Father Crean. They received a tip-off and Mick was arrested at the home of an acquaintance. The same inspector who had arrested him 2 years earlier for the check scam arrested him again, but this time for something much more serious. During questioning he spoke after only half an hour. He confessed to killing the priest. In the meantime, the police also found a fingerprint that linked him to a previous burglary in the area. He was transferred to Brixton Prison, where he awaited trial. He confessed to 3 cases: Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price and Anthony Crean. His defense was defended by attorney Robin Clark, who tried to prove that Patrick suffered from a mental disorder and indeed had a history of psychiatric diagnoses, but when investigators continued to question him, the story took another turn. Patrick began to talk about other cases. He claimed to be responsible for 11 deaths. Among them, according to him, were 3 elderly women: a woman attacked on a train, a woman and her grandson, a man pushed into the river and a shopkeeper seriously injured. However, Patrick later retracted these confessions. In the absence of physical evidence, the police and prosecutors could not charge him with those crimes. In prison he underwent new psychiatric evaluations. The experts agreed. Patrick Mackay was not psychotic, he was accountable, he had a personality disorder, but he knew right from wrong, he felt no guilt or remorse. Dr. James Stewart, proposed by the defense as an expert witness, declined to represent him. Mackay was said to have shown severe emotional detachment, but he was fully aware of his actions, and there is no effective psychiatric treatment for such a condition, then or now. The panel concluded that he was fit to stand trial. The trial was held at the famous Old Bailey. On the 21st of November 1975, Patrick Mackay pleaded guilty not to manslaughter, but to acting under the influence of a disturbed state of mind. He argued that hospital treatment was his last chance to remain human. The prosecution accepted the plea deal, avoiding a long and emotionally devastating trial. The judge described him as a high risk to society and sentenced him to life imprisonment. He was transferred to Wormwood Scrubs prison. Years later, he stated that he considered his life a complete failure. He admitted that he had tried to take his own life several times and that now he just wanted to forget everything. The headlines said it all. The man who took pleasure in violence, dark nature in a black suit. The system ignored the warnings, the consequences were horrific. Looking back, one thing was clear. The signs were there, psychiatrists had raised the alarm, schools had flagged his behavior, social services had written reports. But each time someone chose not to intervene or to wait, and each time Patrick Mackay did exactly what many feared, because, deep down, he had never sought salvation. It seemed that those who could do something did not want to and those who wanted to could not. Patrick Mackay was not someone who would simply grow out of destructive behavior. He was a ticking time bomb, and anyone who knew anything about behavioral problems in young people had to notice what others did not. His potential to become dangerous was frighteningly obvious, but this case is long closed. What remains today is to use it in studying other similar cases to understand how to recognize the most serious forms of aggression and perhaps prevent them. And the best way to do that is to listen to the perpetrators themselves. In his book Lustmord, Brian King also includes excerpts from Mackay's prison diaries, written in 1975 while he was awaiting trial. In them, Patrick recalls his childhood and his father Harry, who became violent when he drank alcohol. Every time he did that, he would hit me with his palm, sometimes even with his fist, he wrote. The father never admitted to having a problem, but Patrick, in hindsight, believes he did. The mother was not spared either. She, like her son, was regularly abused. Really regularly, to the point of bloodshed, MC noted. In October, a month before the verdict, he wrote that he felt remorse. He remembered everything he had done in his series of crimes. I can't understand what drove me to do it. Everything is confusing. Sometimes I even scare myself, he admitted. However, instead of taking responsibility, he often blamed others, his family, psychiatrists, society. Typical of people with antisocial traits. No inner sense of guilt, but a constant position of victim. He also blamed the spirit of the 1960s, the system that, in his opinion, ignored children without parental care. He thought the diagnosis he had received was wrong. Instead of being labeled as lacking empathy and self-control, he began to blame himself. He claimed to have been obsessive, claimed to know his own mind better than doctors, and wanted to be admitted to a psychiatric institution, not prison. He also wrote about his release from Mackay Hospital in 1972. Back then, he said, he had good intentions. He could never have imagined how difficult it would be to adjust to everyday life. Those events had happened so suddenly and so quickly. He claimed not to remember many details, that others had told him what he had done, but that there were some things he could not confirm. He also recalled that after the murder of Isabella Griffith, he tried to cover up the tracks and wanted the victim to appear dignified. He wrote that he hoped that someone might gain some benefit from his notes. "I will not shed a tear," he wrote. "Life is full of shocks. I'm just a bad example, and who is to say that is all?" Quote, "Really? It's one thing to know the details of a case, but it's quite another to extract messages, patterns, and lessons from it that can help prevent similar tragedies from happening again." We still don't know for sure what behavior patterns lead someone to become a serious threat to the community, but we do know that certain behaviors precede such acts more often than others. Risk assessment studies indicate that many perpetrators display similar signs in their youth: difficulty controlling anger, a tendency to seek revenge, impulsivity, and an inability to cope with stress. Behavior is shaped by a combination of what a child sees and learns and how their mind processes it. Children exposed to violence, neglect, or toxic role models are more likely to repeat the same patterns. Factors associated with destructive behavior in adulthood include exposure to harmful substances during pregnancy, chronic maternal stress, early emotional rejection, poor nutrition, low verbal intelligence, and problems with attention and impulsivity. By themselves, these factors do not mean that someone will become a serious offender, but in certain combinations and with certain predispositions, they can become triggers. If children are exposed to violence, neglect, or toxic role models, they are more likely to repeat the same patterns. Factors associated with destructive behavior in adulthood include exposure to harmful substances during pregnancy, chronic maternal stress, early emotional rejection, poor nutrition, low verbal intelligence, and problems with attention and impulsivity. These factors alone do not mean that someone will become a serious offender, but in certain combinations and with certain predispositions, they can become triggers. If children are exposed to violence, neglect, or toxic role models, they are more likely to repeat the same patterns. They do not learn to connect with others, to build their personal value, to develop resilience, emotional intelligence, and empathy. It will be difficult for them to establish healthy relationships, and without this, conflicts are not resolved but explode. In Mackay's case, the signs were present since childhood. Obsessive thoughts, low tolerance for frustration, a broken family system, a tendency to blame others, a lack of empathy, dependency, and emotional instability. The psychiatrists who raised the alarm in time were right, but those who made the decisions did not react, and perhaps everything could have been stopped before more people lost their lives. Because a system that does not recognize and does not stop these cases must reconsider itself and finally adopt a real, effective plan.